Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the EU Power Rankings. Now that we've gone over the teams that failed to qualify for the Red Bull Home Ground event, let's talk about the teams that will be taking part that we haven't spoken about yet and have had their rosters confirmed. Both recently and a while ago, we were deciding on whether to do Ninjas and Pyjamas with G2, but to be honest, I think G2 just overshadowed them in that episode. But we're going to be talking about them, as well as Guild Esports with their confirmation of Safe rejoining the roster, and Baba even coming in as the coach for the team. So before we really get into what Guild Esports can do with the journey of Safe coming back to its natural conclusion, I feel, Ninjas and Pyjamas, they dropped both Looker and Safe in this trade that went to Guild, and they brought in Existence, previously started from CS and all those kinds of teams, and also JD from HSD, who we talked about in the previous episode. I feel like this is a big upgrade to what they had before. I think this roster's a lot scarier, but considering how Ninjas and Pyjamas have conducted themselves in the scene so far strong, I'm not necessarily convinced that we're looking at a top 10 team here, at least to a point where you go, they are affirmatively a top 10 team, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? In terms of the talent, the raw talent on this roster, this is actually pretty encouraging. Everyone's kind of forgotten how good Chihuahua was back in, I mean, not even just in beta, right? Even in early release. He was also playing on those worst player stacks with Pipson, extremely good. Like, one of the star players, essentially. I think he got invited to G2 Invitational, which was a scouting event, let's just admit that now. So
yeah. Dimasic as well was part of that event.
Yeah.
He was pretty good. I think when it comes to like players though, Anders, I'm interested in your take on this one too. Kriya was known as being the 5-head Omen player way back when, but as people have got smarter with playing Valorant, that style has not only been found out, but we might be finding ourselves playing more Brimstone. I don't necessarily think that Kriya is in the same position as, say, Lowell for Heretics with him playing Sage, where he can only play that. I do think the Kriya is a little bit more flexible, but I'm still not convinced with his performances as of late on that controller role.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, he was sort of a benchmark that a lot of people used as like this is an example of what creative ability innovation should look like, and that's faded over time. People have sort of gotten wise to it. In a lot of ways, it actually feels similar to Cryptix on TL, where like he was very much so a bleeding edge player in his role for a very long time. And as people got more acclimated to that style, the tricks sort of ran dry and it felt a little bit stale at a certain point. For me to continue to rate him as like an incredibly high caliber controller, I think that he has to sort of hit a second leg of that innovation, and we haven't seen that yet. Even so, I still rank him as one of the better ones in the region. Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think that with the level of improvement in the roster around him, he sort of has to step up to the plate and show us that he can keep pace with the level of elevation that is happening in every role around him, more or less.
We have some interesting changes with Existence coming in, not only for being an actual IGL, which was always going to be tough for Emil to try and find. There were a lot of tryouts, not only for players, but for talent, for analysts and stuff too, right? Like, they wanted to make sure that they had everything necessary to make this team flourish. But you've got Existence coming in as the IGL, and from my understanding, considering he used to play an Omen Brimstone player beforehand, he's coming in on the Breach and those kind of supportive agents like Sage. Like Strong, I don't know necessarily, I don't want to give him too much negative credit because we've not seen him play on it before. Like, again, with Kriya, it's just a case of we need to see that versatility beforehand. But does that bother you? Is the positives of having a really good IGL with Existence outweigh the negatives that he's coming in to not play the role he's been playing for his Valorant career so far?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of, I mean, I just want to check on BLR. He's literally played nothing except Brimstone Omen. Most players, mostly players who've been around since beta, and again, Existence have been around since beta, have at least dabbled with someone. They've had some tournament where they've played Sage, something like that. He hasn't. So I think it is a concern. I think if he, but I mean, the switching over isn't that difficult, right? If he can be an effective IGL from that position, then that's all kind of negated. The big question mark actually for me with Existence would be with regards to comms, because I may be forgetting something on this, but when I looked it up, I don't think he's ever in his CS career IGL'd on a team that wasn't French speaking. And I believe his reputation was that he was a more cerebral guy from CS anyway. And looking at the players on his roster, he needs to have a big voice in his team. He needs to be like a Pipson type, where he is calling out a lot of things. And it's not to say that he can't do that, but that is going to be the big test for him. If he can be a vocal leader, he can make a fact. You've got two guys, younger CIS guys in JD and Chihuahua. You've got Kreia, who's again got a reputation more of a quiet guy. He's more focused on his own game, right? And you've got Rhyme, who's a bit different, but existence is a big burden's being put on him in terms of communication direction on this team. And as much as I'm sure his English is good, there's a difference between being able to speak a language well and being able to IGL a language well. So that's going to be, it's not a problem so much, but it is a test for them. That's going to be the big test, I think, for whether this roster succeeds or fails.
I would frame it less as a test and more of a growing pain. It's not that I don't have... Test almost implies that there's a possibility of them failing. I don't think that is the case here. I think at worst, there will be a very prolonged dry spell. Like worst case scenario, he takes a long time to acclimate into it and sort of find his voice. I think that with the infrastructure in place that they have, where Emil's at the helm and they're bringing in analysts and whatnot, I think that he has the resources around him where over time they will eventually push him into the IGL conditioning that he needs to have. Like he will fill that role eventually because they will turn him into that and encourage him to do that as he needs to. But how long that takes is really the question we should be asking ourselves. I also think it's super interesting. I mean, Ryan, you mentioned this like very, very briefly, but the fact that he's going to be IGLing from sort of that flash wielding initiator role. If you look statistically at what IGLs play on a global basis, this is one of those things where like I was going to make a video on it eventually. There is a very clear trend in what IGLs play in this game. And it is controller far away the most. Then you drop down to Sova initiators. Then you drop down to sentinels. And then you drop down to like flash entry, secondary initiator type folks. So he is literally like an incredibly uncommon role in terms of what he is IGLing on, and which is very interesting.
Yeah, the only one like, well, the name that comes to mind with regards to also doing that is Eccles, right?
Boaster as well.
Like that's it's not completely unheard of, but you're right in regards to it is unusual.
Yeah,
and it is going to be a challenge to adjust in that regard.
Yeah, I guess Lowell as well, if you're looking at the supporting role as opposed to the agent, is another one. I think it's more common in Europe, North America, because nobody plays Breach. That's probably why more than anything.
NA, it's like all controllers and Sova players. Those are your IGLs. Every single one of them.
You sort of mentioned before, like, provided Ninjas in Pyjamas have the time to go through these growing pains, that to me is the deciding factor, honestly. To go on a bit of a rant about this, I feel like Ninjas in Pyjamas, with all of the rosters that they've had in the past, could have been way more successful if they gave them a little bit more time. I think that the amount of roster moves that they've made over not even the year of Valorant is insane. I understand some of the decisions, such as the Paladins roster, that they wanted to move around and actually get some players like Grime and build around them. But I certainly think that when you bring in Emil, you brought in Safe before, and Safe is an interesting one. If he wanted to go back to Guild, there's really not much that Ninjas in Pyjamas could have done about it. But I do think that considering this Ninjas in Pyjamas team almost got into first strike, I think if they played against Guild in that game to qualify, which they should have done if Guild didn't get disqualified in that tournament, instead Nip had to play G2 and they got 2-0'd very easily. So it's going to be difficult to be Nip in that scenario when you're preparing to play Guild and then, oh no, it's G2 and they just come in and hook, line and sinker you. I'm worried about this team when it comes to how the upper staff treat it. If they don't see the results during the first part of Challengers and Masters, that they'll again start cutting players, that they'll get rid of Emil. And I think that if you are a player, a coach, an analyst in that scenario, you are never going to truly have that vision even, because I think something like Team Liquid, similar position, but there's almost that trust in Sliggy approach, and that we're playing the long game. I think Vitality or Frenzy Go Kill is a similar thing, right? It's like, we want to do well in this tournament coming up, sure, But we're preparing for 2022 when maybe there's like a franchise league coming in, or 2023. It's more about putting this roster together and having it flourish by that point. I'm worried about Ninja in Pyjamas' attitudes previously, that it's just going to ruin this squad of really talented players before it even gets going. That's the thing that concerns me the most about NiP.
I actually have some thoughts on that with regards to... So this is the thing. I've criticized many times in the past some of the decisions that NiP have made with regards to the way they changed their roster. The funny thing is, I think the overarching idea they had, looking at it from an org perspective, was not bad with regards to treating how you treat the first year of a game. Because if when we have tournaments in April or May or whatever, realistically, like, if we've been in previous esports, realistically, okay, we know that 80% of these players won't be here 2 years from now. It's harsh, but it is the reality of things, right? So if you're signing a team early on, you're signing players early on, you're signing it with the explicit knowledge that, okay, there's a good chance a lot of these players will not make it long term. You are going to have to you're going to have to find what works, cut the chaff, bring more players in, find what works, cut the chaff. There's a process to it, right? And NiP have been too eager to pull the trigger at times, perhaps, and they've made poor decisions with regards to which direction they've gone, potentially. But the overall process isn't bad, right? The worst thing that can be said about NiP in that regard is that you haven't really... They've gone through like 4 rounds of this now, and they haven't really established a core, right? I think Chihuahua's the 3rd most tenured player on this roster, which that is a bit of a... You don't necessarily trust all... There's no necessarily, okay, looking at 2 or 3 players on that team where I know they're going to be cohesive with each other. I know that they're good enough going to be long term, and they're going to work together well. They haven't really got to that part of it, which has been a tactical failure, but the strategic goal, I think, is fine. So what I have to hope is that they've kind of gone for that first and be like, okay, well, we've got what is quite a good roster now. It's not as solid as we maybe wanted it to be. It's not as we can be sure this is going to work in terms of we've got a core now for going long term. But they maybe now think, okay, well, we have got a good team together, and we have to give this team time now. It's not just a question of... Because after the first year, right, that 20% goes up a lot very, very quickly. Players, or most top players in the scene will at least be around in 2 years from now, right? Just because of how the nature of esports works. And my hope would be that NiP kind of see it in that way, and okay, well, we've got good players, we've got a good coach. Now we trust them. We hard-nosed business reality. We were willing to cut heavy before. Now we trust them. That's got to be the hope. We'll see if it's the reality, but I don't think that's impossible.
No, I get what you mean, and I think certainly when you look at some of the players like Hip, Faroff, I think are really good examples of like they were fine, but I think that when you look at the players that have been brought in since, you kind of go, pound for pound, these betters are better than the ones that you have at the moment, so it makes sense. But you also have to look at the fact that NiP had Zipan in their roster at one point. They had Yassine in their roster at some point. They have had really strong players that have gone on to flourish in other teams that are now doing much better than them because of the mishandling in some given scenarios. And I think, Anders, this is a nice segue onto the next edition of that for NiP, which is JD. And I'm curious to get your perspective on certainly JD versus Looker. It might be a bit unfair onto Looker in some cases, but there's a lot of, oh yeah, JD is cracked. Why is he cracked? How is he cracked? What does he do so well that other players don't deal with? And bear in mind that JD is like, what, 17 years old as well? 18? He's still super young, and he has the chance to improve on it. But why is he so good, and why pick him up and drop Looker?
So it's really funny because trying to compare him 1-to-1 with Looker is like, just, it doesn't work. Looker was like a very good secondary opper that was being put into a primary opper role, which I always thought was really odd and uncomfortable for him, and it showed in the way that he was playing it. In my opinion, Looker's best games was when he was opping from Sova and Sage, not when he was opping on Jett. And I mean, that's a personal take. I don't know if anyone agrees with me on that, but that was always my read.
When he stood in for Big, he played the Sova and the Sky, and he looked better than I've ever seen him.
He was so much better than he usually was. I was like, why is this not the norm? Jaddy is coming in, and I think that he is far better rifling in general than he is on the op, and I categorize him as a positional fragger. He's the type of person that you put on Sova, and there will be rounds and strings of rounds where he is very greedy with his utility, but he's greedy with it because he's going to clap people. Like, there will be rounds where your IGL is going to be working without a recon bolt because he used it to get an opening frag that just realistically shouldn't be happening, because he uses it to get soft info for himself, swings, and just out rifles the guy. That's the excitement that Jaddy brings to the table. And I think that a big part of that comes from the fact that he's a little bit on the younger side. He's willing to take risks that a more calculated sort of veteran mind may not be as immediately willing to take. And that gives them a certain amount of like excitement factor. Like it's the X factor for that team. And I think that based off of the way that NiP has been playing in the past, like they were in desperate need of X factor, the way they were sort of eking out their surprise element prior to now was like, okay, Kree's going to do this wild nonsense, or we're gonna leverage Rhyme to do something crazy. But that wasn't honestly the most effective thing. It wasn't consistent at the very least. And I think that this opens up a new channel for that to happen that is going to be far more reliable for them.
Speaking of reliability, Strong, we have apparently got Ryan moving over to the duelist for this team. And I know that you've sort of come up saying he's like James Milner when it comes to like football or soccer, when it comes to consistency. Always good, never bad, but never great at the same time. Is that a good move to put him on such a pivotal role, or are you kind of worried that we're not going to see insane performances out of him?
It's an odd change, right? Because as you say, in the past, he hasn't exactly set the world on fire. I think it's a case you have to see it in practice, because to give credit to him, the James Milner analogy isn't like a negative thing, right? It's everything that's been thrown at Rhyme, he's done well with, right? He's had to play a lot of different roles. He's had to play with a lot of different rosters. Obviously, he's the one element of continuity, literally going all the way back to, I don't know if he played NiP's first tournament, but he certainly played NiP's second. He's been there the whole time. He's always been serviceable. He's always held his own. It's an odd move in terms of it makes him less explosive, but to be fair, I'd kind of rather have people like JD and Chihuahua playing those sorts of mid-round rifle roles, and Ryan sort of risking his life to get the entry, right? That seems like actually a better combination of anything. So we'll have to see. It's really difficult to say, but the credit you've got to give to Ryan is he's taken everything that's been thrown at him with a bomb so far, right? So maybe he'll be really good with a bomb as well. Yeah,
just having a sense of consistency across the board for NiP would be a huge help. But now we get on to where we're placing them in the rankings, and I don't think this is going to be too hard. I think that Ninjas in Pyjamas are better than the teams that we highlighted previously, the likes of Defuse, HSD, and so on and so forth. I think that you can put them over there, at least if you're looking at it on the face of it. HSD could impress, but I think these improvements to NiP are great when it comes to the individuals, players that they've brought in. I don't know if I'd rate them over Team Liquid, though. I just feel like they're both in very similar spots when it comes to how they've dealt with the hands that they've been given. But I think that you would have to put them within the top 10, but barely in some cases. But I don't know what you guys think. But I'm tentatively putting them below Team Liquid in this rankings, but just below them.
I put them tentatively just above TL in this ranking.
Okay.
I think so. My rationale is if they are more or less dead level, if they are like basically here and they're in a similar situation, I favor the team that just made a bunch of positive changes versus the team that...
Team Liquid did get through to the main event, and they did so against basically Giants Gaming, which is above them. They did it dominantly, and they took Heretics to the closest game that I think anybody took to them within First Strike. NiP, whilst they did play up against G2, when in reality they were expecting Guild, they didn't get there, and they didn't look good in that series with G2 either, to say the least. They just did not know how to play up against a 7-piece Sage at that point, which I think everybody got used to at that point. So I feel like I do think that these are positive changes for NiP, but I do think that the results have maybe put Liquid in a negative light, but when you look at the fact that they went really close with Heretics, they made it to the main event by beating a team that was still putting above them, I think you have to give Liquid just a bit more credit there.
I mean, the one thing I'll say is remember Nip beat Heretics. Nip actually knocked Heretics out the first qualifier, 13.
That is true. So you basically say this all doesn't matter and we should just stop it now. Just throw it out. Honestly, the biggest wild card of this so far, I think Guild has been a great addition to not only European Valorant, but esports in general. I think that it's a cool thing. Everything they've done so far is a breath of fresh air. But I don't think that we should be rating Guild any higher than Heretics is off the face of it. And I just know that Anderzz has opinions of this, so we'll start with that. What are your opinions of this?
I'll agree with you. I will say that I think rating them higher than Heretics would be a pretty big troll right now.
You're going to say that they're like worse than Defuse, I feel like you're...
No, the exact opposite. I put them above NIP.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. Do you put them over Giants Gaming, though?
No, I don't. Yeah. I rate Giants very highly in all fairness, though.
Yeah.
I have big stonks on
It depends how you rate Giants.
So why are they better than NIP and TL?
If you look at Guild's sort of narrative at this point, they have proven to be, at certain points in their history, a top 2 team in the region. Like, they have consistently been terrifying. The times when they've sort of fallen off of the radar and people have sort of started thinking less of them, what were the reasons? They punted a series because Yassine went on breach for God knows what reasons, and they got DQ'd. Are you really going to hold that against the team for, from the perspective of their long-term potential? They're bringing in a coach now, so macro strategic nonsense like misallocating agent picks shouldn't be happening from here on out. And they have infrastructure now, and they've been slapped on the wrist hard enough that they shouldn't be making exploit DQs a thing anymore. You almost have to rate them highly. You're literally looking at a team that historically has been at the top of the region, debatably.
Realistically, before they were Guild, right, when they were bonked, they were probably the 3rd best team in the region, you could argue, with regards to results over the entirety of Ignition. Like, they have been at the top for a long time. Obviously, they faltered quite badly at points, but to be fair, it's one of those cases where I think their losses are looking a lot better in retrospect, funnily enough, because you remember one of the more embarrassing losses was to All the Rage. All the Rage became XR Esports. XR Esports became FQ and Sender, now on Vitality, and recognized that, and we'll talk about Vitality later, but suffice to say, not a shabby team by any means. I do think you have to put Guild over Liquid and NIP. Giants, it depends how you rate Giants, but the potential is there, right? The potential is there. The question with Guild, it always is the person. Like, you have a lot of very strong personalities on that team, and bringing Safe back in. I mean, maybe he's been chastened enough to sort of reduce that problem, but that's always the thing that's scary. Right? Those, apart from Ziz, Leo, however he's going by today, the other 4 very strong, very, very colourful, very strong personalities, and sometimes that works great, but there's always a potential there for conflict, right? So
I think Safe coming back is a really good addition, but I don't think it necessarily fixes anything. I don't think Goffy played that badly, in all honesty, so I feel a bit bad for him for being thrown to the wayside very quickly within his tenure. But I'm worried about Safe more than I'm excited for him, because whilst he is a great player, I'm worried about how he's going to come into a team, because for NIP, he played a particular role. I think he played a role that he wanted to play, and it didn't work out. Like, he is a player that, under Yassine's guidance, potentially, he can play Viper when he wants to. He can do whatever he wants when it comes to agent picks, and his team will be like, you do you, we'll work around it, because that's been the plan for Bonk for the most part. I don't know how that's going to work going forward, or whether that has the legs to continue to be a valid strategy going forward. So I'm curious of what you think about Safe coming back, Anderzz, and certainly with the hero flexibility that he has, how that could positively or negatively impact Guild at this point.
I think that the way you have to look at it is he is now coming back to something that he knows what he's signing up for. I feel like he was on this team originally and it sort of evolved around him, and like the ecosystem that he was in was the ecosystem that he was in. He now has experience where he's gone elsewhere, like experienced a different environment, and he still actively chose to come back to this one. Like he could have gone to another team. There's no doubt that when he said, I'm a free agent, he got offers from other teams. He decided that this is where he wanted to end up, and he knew exactly what he was getting himself back into. So I think that my concerns in terms of like strong personality clashes and this, that, and the other thing are pretty quelled. I think that my biggest concern is going to be who is the ultimate driving force behind the team's like broader overarching strategy. I know that Bonker is like a huge like 5-head for this game in terms of like agent theory and compositional theory and just like general approach. How is that going to mesh with Barber? How does that sort of lean on Safe's agent pool? How do they best take advantage of what he brings to the team as a player? Those are sort of the moving pieces that I'm the most interested in, not whether or not Safe is going to be capable of meshing with the team on like a personality level.
I get why rating him over Guild would be good against Nip and TL, but why would you rate them worse than Giants?
You have like it's just confidence in Pipson versus Bonker. I think with Pipson, we've seen him build something on the server a lot more recently. Guild, obviously, they did an incredible job building back after being kicked from Nip, right? Bonker and Yassin went out, found these players, found this roster, put this all together. Great. They did a great job at building back, but we kind of saw look, down, up, down, kicked from Nip, up, bonks together, well, bonks great. And you kind of saw it slowly going down again.
I do think there's some of the negative sides of Guild sloping down where, you know, for example, a Blast Invitational. They weren't invited. They were invited ahead of them. And a lot of people did cry out saying that they invited the wrong team when it came to the results that Bonk had at that time. But I do feel comfortable and confident. I thought this was going to be a lot more of a hot take. Guild are the third best team in Europe at this point. But I think certainly when you look at the lineup from top to bottom, obviously you have G2 and FPX, but then you've got Heretics, Giants, Guild, Nip, and TL. That makes a lot of sense to me. I do think that as more teams come in, certainly more of the CIS or Turkish teams, I don't think that they would necessarily start to slip into these cracks between the teams that we mentioned. I think that you kind of have to put like BBL, Fubalist, Gambit below TL at this point. I don't think that Liquid should fall any further, but it mostly depends on Summon and Vitality, right? I think they're the other teams coming in. Potentially today, OG might be part of the party, but I think now this is starting to take hold, certainly when you're looking at the top 10. But again, if you guys have any points to make over the list that we have so far, which again is G2, FPX, Heretics, Giants, Guild, Nip, and Liquid, is there anything that you change at this point? Are you pretty happy and comfortable with that listing?
That is bang on my listing.
We can discuss the Heretics thing, but that's for another show, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like you don't need to argue against Heretics at this point either, because I think whilst we've been rather negative on them, I think these two teams don't quite, stand up to a team that's actually gone and won against some of these top teams instead of being in amongst them. But that's going to do it for this episode. We will have, hopefully, a Summon of Vitality coming up, depending on when Vitality, if they get announced before this tournament, if they get announced at all, or whether we are all completely wrong. Fubalist will probably add to that list too. So for that episode before Home Ground, be sure to keep an eye out for it by liking and subscribing. And we'll see you in the future. Bye-bye.